All right, greetings everyone. Just want to welcome you. This is I think this is week 4 of our lecture series from the Intro to Black World Studies course, looking at Caribbean and Latin American, particularly paying attention to Jamaican culture and history and aspect of Caribbean and Latin American experience. All right, so and also too, want to take a moment to welcome people who might be um, viewing this via the Black Arts Festival. Some of this material in this lecture will be particularly relevant to understanding, the Queen Nanny film. I think the other film there as well, which would be sort of connected to this, is the Bob Marley film. So this might provide some input and context, historical, um, for folks who may be welcoming, and we want to welcome you as well. Um, so with that, we'll get started. All right, so the main thing we really want to sort of take a look at here, in this little study, right? Jamaica in the Black world, right? And we got sort of 3 main topics we want to sort of unpack: sugar, slavery, and then the experience of maroons, right? So those are our 3 sort of main topics here. We'll unpack. All right. So let's start just with a little bit talking about sugar, right? And sugar and what it means, right? We know of it as the sort of commodity that will really get the whole ball rolling in terms of large numbers of Africans coming here to the Americas as slave labor. This is the catalyst. This is one of the key catalysts. A lot of people, presumably put cotton in there, but sugar's the early one, right? And then the sugar and the rice, right? It's these kinds of things, these kinds of commodities that they took advantage of. These Africans, some of them, had prior experience with working with these sorts of agricultural products anyway, especially on the rice. But anyway, so you had a lot of people being brought in, right, to places in. Really, it's northeast Brazil, where right away you're going to see large numbers of Africans coming in and working and being brought there largely to cultivate sugar cane, right, in large numbers. A lot of numbers coming from West Central Africa in that moment, right? But if we think about maybe some trajectories to maybe the more of the United States Black American experience, I think sort of in the Caribbean there we want to look at the English colonies. So in that context, Barbados and Jamaica are very, very, very important, right? And Barbados was very early. It was one of the earliest, most profitable English colonies for sugar, right? But it wasn't long before you saw the oil begin to get exhausted. Even by the early part of the 19th century, it was apparent, even a bit early, if I'm not mistaken, it was apparent that the soil was starting to be depleted from all of the sugar, sugar cane agriculture, right? But it also kind of Jamaica comes along as a nice sort of substitute, a nice addition there, after they wrestled it away from the Spanish in 1655. And they're fighting a bit. By this time, Spain is pretty much, doesn't have that much of a toehold in Jamaica, right? That's what you sort of find out. And really what you have, even in 1655, really even prior to that, is you had loose gangs of African folks who had found ways to coexist, broke away from slavery, and found ways to coexist with the local native folks like the Arawak, other people who were living right in these areas, right? And that's how they learned to survive and modify their own sort of African agricultural and botany knowledge to apply to the Americas, right? So very, very important. That's happening, right? Uh, uh, um, while the Spanish are being fighting for their last little bit, and then the English are moving in, right? Um, and then it's going to take a while, but you could see by the numbers of slaves over really starting from the last half of the 17th century on into the 19th century, you can start to see the numbers. The numbers start to tell you what's happening, right? 1661, for a snapshot year, only 514 slaves in the Jamaican colony, right? That's 5 years after they take it from the Spanish, right? But then by 1713, that other snapshot, you can see I'm on 55,000, right? And then you do another one, 1817. By that time, you get about 350,000, maybe higher numbers, and they fluctuate up and down some within those sort of parameters. But you could see, though, a very clear connection between sugar and, of course, enslavement. And I always put these pictures up here because it always just sort of reminds me of, my visits to Jamaica as a researcher, but also too as a tourist, and going to those resorts and thinking about what it was Jamaica historically during the time of enslavement and sugar exploitation, and then what it is now in terms of this sort of tourist community, right? Think of it. I mean, and really, a thing that comes out is that the slavery here is quite significant in terms of its impact and foothold compared to what you see in North America, right? So, for instance, where you may have about 20 or so slaves on average in the North American colonies, right? I mean, the Carolinas and Virginia, they're going to vary. Those numbers are going to get a little bit higher, right? Once you get into the Southeast, the numbers are going to maybe will fluctuate a little higher. But on average, this is looking at it on average, that's about 20, right? And compared to the size in the Caribbean, which is 100 plus on average. I mean, it's very telling in terms of what folks were doing with the land. Any bit of arable land, except in the mountainous regions, which they didn't have access to, they were putting it to work for sugar. I mean, and for other maybe sustainable crops, just enough to keep people on the island going, and some small landholders who are also, obviously farming their crops as well, right? But you could see, looking at the two pictures, right? I mean, I always envision, we go there, you get those blue drinks, you're sitting out in the sun, you're enjoying yourself, relaxing, right? And compare that to this sort of the Caribbean was, and particularly Jamaica, was seen as a hot, disease, death-ridden place, right? Absentee and land ownership, right? And what does that mean? Of course, that the Europeans hired out folks to go down there. The wealthy Europeans hired out less wealthy Europeans to act as on their behest in the colonies, right? And so that included being the overseer and other aspects of bringing that crop to fruition, so you could get it out of that sugarcane crop before it's spoiled, keeping the slaves in check. I mean, all this was part of a task that you gave to a sort of overseer and maybe someone who would act as maybe sort of a landlord there. But the owner of that land, right, would be absentee, would be in Europe, would be in England, presumably, right? If we're talking about Jamaica, right? So again, that's going to make the number of African or people of African descent compared to those people who are of European descent 10 to 1, right? Couple that, and these ratios are very important. Some of these demographics are very, very important, right? And balanced sex ratio in terms of male female, sort of deplorable working conditions, right? Where you had this sort of life expectancy, which was often less than 10 years, right? And it's a telling statistic that 85,000 slaves are imported between like 1708 and 1735, but it only raises the entire population regionally by about 4,000 people, right? I mean, so what's happening to those other folks? Where you could see how slavery is just exacting them, right? And taking their experience and taking everything out of them and sucking them pretty dry physically, and then just leaving them to die, right? That's essentially what slavery is doing, and using a lot of force to do it, right? Among other things, right? So you could imagine the idea of getting away from that was something that people were like, yeah. How do we go again? When do we leave again? What time are we leaving again? Right? You know, and so the maroon societies are very, very relevant in this context. They're under recognized, unfortunately. Here's another aspect of history that we need to sort of get a better grip on, right? We talk about liberty and freedom and have such conversation about this stuff. We think we know all this story, but presumably we don't, because we're not really getting at this. And this is a key element of our experience, of the Black experience, maroonage, right? What is it? Well, people broke away from these societies. People broke away from these slavocracies. People broke away from these plantations. People broke away from these mines. They didn't stay there. And it may seem sort of obvious to us now, but the presumption that people would acquiesce or accept slavery and just bow down completely in its entirety and become sort of attuned to slavery, or there's a better word I'm thinking of, right? And sort of adjust people's minds to presumably they don't even see freedom. They just expect and anticipate to live as a slave, right? This was one of the sort of ways people sort of describe what Africans could be reduced to, right? Essentially through the system of servitude. But maroonage reminds us that that's just not the case at all, as you can see, right? And in everywhere, they're everywhere, right? In Northeast Brazil, since sort of that's where we started. Let's go back and just look there just for a second. And you got some 30,000 people living in a community up in what is called the Palmares. I mean, this is an incredible story. I'm just touching the surface on this one. but just know that for about 2 centuries they had a pretty powerful community up there, and it took the Dutch and the Portuguese to get up there to sort of finally have to get them out, and essentially the sort of community itself still remains, right? And one of the hallmarks. I mean, just think of this. If you know what capoeira is in terms of that this dance fighting style, right? This was where it originated from, right? The Palmares or Quilimbos of Northeast Brazil. They are an incredible story. You always hear me talking about us needing to tell these history. There's one right there. But again, let me this is Jamaica. But anyway, they're all over. You see, Maroons are everywhere: Suriname, Cuba, Haiti, and many other places connected to the North Atlantic or to the Americas through the North Atlantic, through the seaboard. So they're coming up and down the Atlantic coast, right? Right there along, you catch up along Jamaica, you hit Florida, you cruise right on up to the Carolinas. There you go, right? All the way up to the north. And so you did have this sort of interchange, right? But that doesn't mean that there weren't Maroons here in North America, because there were. In fact, there are a number of very, very new recent books, not very recent. There are some that have been out. There's a new one. I believe the title is A Desolate Place for a Defiant People. I'm looking at that title there. And it's about Maroons in the Carolinas, right? So that tells us that people in all places, don't think this is just something that only occurred in Jamaica or in the Caribbean. You could see from the numbers that people found ways to break away from these societies. And we ought to start to think around slavery as having this as a facet of the slave experience. Because right along with it, right along with the enslavement, people broke away. And oftentimes there's an interrelationship between the communities too. That's kind of an interesting one too. That sort of plays out, right? But presumably, right, a couple things are happening. They're showing and demonstrating us the adaptability of African cosmologies to new environments, for sure, right? And they're interacting with Native Americans in ways that the Europeans just are not doing, right? So those things right there are significant, right? And I mean, the way you study this stuff, you can see I'm getting all cheesy because this is a subject that I've actually spent some time doing research on. But when you start bringing the archival, the archaeological, the ethnographic, and the oral evidence together, it really begins to tell us quite an amazing story about the Black experience. And yeah, and the Jamaican experience is the Black experience, right? So I hope we're clear about that one. But and these guys, again, they had a really interesting sort of relationship because, of course, the Maroons communities grew from the size of the number of people who had run away. So early in the game, I mean, and this is all the way up until about the 1740s. We'll talk about what happens then, right? People would just break away from the slavery and go and join these folks. They leave all the time en masse. They come up to people, hey, we're done doing so and so and so and so, and guess what? Peace out. We out, and they all will go. And I mean, remember the demographics now. They start to play because you're talking about 10-1. What is they gonna do? And they would get the weapons. There were ways, man. I mean, this is why we need to know these stories, because they're part of the consciousness of our experience and our resistance to slavery. And they're wider. I mean, they're impactful in North America, but they're wider than North America. They're wider than North America, right? And it invites us to look at the African experience from a bit of a broader lens. That's another thing about these Maroons. But it can bring us to a local spot because, again, you got Maroons who lived in all places, right? And there's an interesting intersection of folks who will break away, at least runaway folks, running into Illinois country from the Louisiana places, and there are definitely folks who are coming straight from West Central Africa. They're Congolese people, and that's up into the 19th century. So that's what I'm saying is that there's some imprints here that we got to take a more critical and closer look at. And what are some of the leave us some things, right? Iron production, farming, right? The sort of transfer of African technologies in a range of different ways, right? Culture, just the sort of traditions, the ideas, the cosmologies, right? Politics, right? And guerrilla war tactics, and which they perfected up in these mountains. They figured it out. Just like you talk about capoeira with the Palmares, you think about the Jamaican Maroons and the use of what we will call what's becomes called ambuscade or ambush, right? And it's the sort of way that they use this sort of guerrilla style to fight. We'll talk more about that momentarily. But I mean, again, I can't stress that sort of intersection of the Native American groups, because early on they are the ones who will assist these folks to get a foothold and become as successful in using the land and other things. And though some Native groups will die out, some will integrate. You have other stories. There are other stories. This is why you got to just open up a channel on this, because you talk about the Garifuna folks, and then now you see Native peoples who, and with African folks, sort of really interact in some very interesting ways. And those folks still exist to this very day, right? You know, we know about the Garifuna, so that kind of thing. In fact, we'll put up a link to some Garifuna music and culture and history, so folks can take a look at that as well on the Black Arts Festival site. All right. So one of my favorite sort of maroon stories, right, that really gets at the heart of who these people are is Grandy Nanny, right? She is just the truth, right? And again, under recognized in our sort of historical tradition and understanding and perceiving of all this, but she brings so much to sort of the narrative of this, right? Before I sort of talk about, well, these flaming projectiles, but let me just read this little quote to you guys, okay? This is from my book. I actually also added this up as a resource. It's just a little snippet. It's not very large. And then I also added next to that the actual piece of litigation, the 1733 Act. So there's a copy of that, as well as this sort of little short oral tradition, which I'm going to read very quickly to you now. Right? So it says, Captain Studdard and 800 soldiers were led up by a spy into Nanny Town, and they found the huts of the Maroons on the mountaintop. But the soldiers wouldn't pitch their tent. They settled down in those huts. At midnight, the Maroons throw torch on the huts. Maroon burned down Buckra house them. When them used to fight them split the wood, them called the Kaja stick. And I'll just say, Kaja is candia, a wood that does have a bit of a flammable. It can be made to burn, especially if you let it get nice and dry and dip it in kerosene or something inflammable, right? Which is what they did. So it come like kerosene oil. He said it blow like fire, and it sit them down in daytime, and it cut them. And I said, so they sit them down in the daytime, and then cut them out and sharpened them. They split them into lengths of about a yard or so, and lit them. And when the soldiers were sleeping, thinking all was well, and threw them down on the thatch and burned down the entire place. You can imagine the type of fear that pervaded the entire atmosphere of these soldiers who just thought they had conquered. Right now, that's from the Jamaican tradition, right? So, like you may hear that tradition and say, oh, okay, these are people up here. This is Bob Marley or something. They up in the mountains up here, no telling. You know, they smoking weed or something. They're not talking about nothing, right? And then you come into the Act of 1733 in the Acts of Assembly, which I've included for you to take a look at, just so you can see it, right? And what does the Act very clearly say? To prevent the making of, throwing, or firing of squibs, serpents, rockets, or other fireworks. So they was doing something up there, because you can see the law kicked in right in the time frame. At the tradition, right? And the siege of Nanny Town. The British are coming up the mountains, right? But it's an incredible sort of scenery and a setting for the sort of battles that will take place for, in part, to maintain the slavocracy, right? It was a battle for slavery, though, in a lot of ways. This was I would call it one for the Caribbean, because it reverberated. And guess what? This is before Haiti, right? This is before Haiti, 2 generations before Haiti, right? And they were tearing the English up down here, right? And going back and forth. And there were some serious battles here, right? And you could just imagine here you have these mountains that are 1,000 or so feet up, right? And some of them blocked by clouds and what have you. And you get up there, and then there's 30 or 40 acres where you can go up there and just, there's a spring up there also, right? I mean, I've climbed up, not as high, but I've seen some of these places. They exist, right? And so you could imagine how hard that would be to bring a 18th or 19th century army up these precipices, bring all this stuff with you. Your gun, which were very heavy guns. I mean, some of that stuff was very heavy to move. They needed what the howitzer that they would bring. They needed a gun because they had to come and sort of blast them people out of there. But imagine setting that up in the mountains, right? And trying to do all this. And then you got the Maroons, who were playing this game that we call guerrilla warfare, that we call today guerrilla warfare. But it's really what they were doing, this ambuscade, right? They knew how to live and move in and around and in and out of that forest zone, and so they could be treacherous to the English army. They could be treacherous to the English army. And then you add the, imagine the English forces met with, it's up there. There's no light. It's black, right? And it's rain or it's dark. It's complete silence. It's hot in the mud, and you're up there. All of a sudden, you think you hear something. You didn't hear something. There's somebody. Everybody starts shooting. It's off, gunfire. You can imagine, and people up close, right up close, fighting like that. It had to have been something. I mean, it's something, right? And see, this nanny, what nanny represented was a lot of things, because not she as a real historical figure, but also as a spiritual leader, she was very significant, right? They call her Nanti Natu Capone, right? And that affiliates her name with God. Acapone, Yan Capone is the name of God in the Akan, right? So you can see the African connection is very strong just in that context alone, right? But by the time it gets to Jamaica, it's modified. It's modified. It's modified to what you got to deal with when you're here, right? But she became recognized to have more science than fighting, right? She knew how to do the science, in the fighting. I'm sorry. Than her brother Kojo, because there's also Kojo's Maroons. Whole another story, right? Whole another interesting story, right? But Nanny's Windward Maroons, right? They're trying to get this treaty in 1740, right? And so they finally get this worked out. This is what it says, right? They're finally able to come to treaty in 1740, and actually theirs is after Kojo's Maroons. But there's this little tradition that demonstrates her sort of spiritual power, right? So at the signing of this moment, right, she orders 50 soldiers to load their guns and fire on her, right? And like she turns to her side, and then she folds back her hands and between her legs and catches all the 50 shots, right? So all these shots they get caught. And it's an interesting kind of thing. I mean, visually you think about what's going on here, right? But that's how the Maroons tell the story, and they pushed back on some of this more contemporary critiques of the story, because they said that tells the story within their context and their experience, because it represented something, right? And I think in many ways it represented the capacity of Nanny and her Maroons to bring in people not just from the Akan folks, and they were the largest number that were there, but also people from all other groups in Africa who wanted and were willing to come up there in the mountains and join them during this time, right? And they were obliged by oath according to this tradition, right? They obliged the men to be true to them by oath, which is held very sacred among the Negroes or the Black people, right? That's from that early tradition, so that's why you see that use of that word that way, right? But Nanny's the mother of all Maroons. She's something spectacular, right? And you know what else? Of all, she's you could go again to the Acts of Assembly there, and you can look up the treaty of 1740, and what you're going to see is her name is mentioned, Nanny's name, a great Negro woman in a grant of 500 acres to build Moortown, the new Maroon town. And to this, that's the history. That's the history. So the British, to stop the Maroons from destroying them, signed a treaty, right? And the one they signed with Nanny this is the second one, right? Her brother Kojo is the other, right? But really, again, this is the centerpiece. They were always the stronger Maroons, and they were always connected with the Maroons of Kojo's Maroons. The Kojo's Maroons are actually a break off from the Windward Maroons. The Windward Maroons were there first. They were earlier. Kojo and then break out, right, and go and start their own separate thing, right? And their stories of one too, right? They're called the Leeward Maroons, right? And here again, so we see this African sort of connection coming up. They have Akan day names. Think about Akan day names, right? You get a name based on the day you were born. I'm Kofi, so I'm Friday born. Kojo is an Akan day name, right? Monday born child, right? And each one they have different names for men, different names for women, based on the day that you're born. You get these names, right? It's very interesting stuff. And based on your day that you're born, right? If you want to, you could go and look and figure out what your kind of day name would be. But like the fact that he had this, and that it was well known that it was a name from West Africa, the Gold Coast region of West Africa, as was Nanny, and as was the Akapong piece, connected. So you could see that, right? They were very, very vitally tied. And then there's the spirit piece, what is called Obe or Obayifo, right? If you use the tree word is Obayifo, right? But what they called it here was Obe. And though it has facets of a range of different African systems in there, not just those from the Akan, but the Akan is the most vital. And that presumably is notable in the name, Obayifo. It's kind of like, if I could compare it to Voodoo, right? Even though the Voodoo has West Central African connections, right? The most vitalist component is the folks of the, Dahomey, the Fumbi people, right? Who are by the Benin, right? And they become the biggest, most vibrant number. That's where Voodoo originated from. Right. So, but you still have a large aspect of that is integrated with West African and West Central African tradition, like the Yoa cross, which we talked about last week. Right. But the Akan is very vital here, right? And it should be noted that, right? And these Maroons, they begin to sort of take this name, right? On the leeward side and on the windward side. This is another connection, Komaratin, right? And the name connected to something. There's a castle called Fort Kormati. And in fact, in our class, we'll take a look at some images of that castle. But you could Google it. It's called Fort Amsterdam, right? That's the name of it. It's on the coast of Ghana, the modern Republic of Ghana. Look, Google Fort Amsterdam or Komaratin, and this is the fort. But many of these folks, this is where they came from. So they, in part, took the name of the fort, but the name has deeper symbolism and connection. It's not entirely about the slave piece, right? But no, I think you'd be wrong to say that they're Komati people in Africa. But all these people who were Khan, this became sort of an aspect of a connector for them, right? There's more there that you could really unpack in terms of showing how that connection is very, very vital. But once again, you see some connections, right? When this treaty ends, that they will sign in 1739, by the way, right? So it's just before Nanny will do it on the other side, right? But once they sign that treaty, they ask for a blood oath, right? And to this day, there's a lot of debate about that because all the oral traditions verify blood oath, right? And even in the some of the English accounts that they wrote, the letters and kept the archival evidence, they make mention of a calabash, but they won't say what it was for, this kind of thing. So there's some intimations going on there. And not to mention too, like music is the thing, because I mean, this is a whole nother story, but music is the thing that will help to end the fighting. Right, and it's not because the Maroons. This is wars difficult for everybody, but the Maroons have been holding the upper hand, right, and they keep it because they're able to sign treaties that give them some power, right. There is a condition to the treaty, right, which says essentially that they have to go and hunt the slaves, right, and a lot of folks. I mean, that's a point of contention, and it should be, because it is a point of contention. Because those folks had been the ones who had actually been helping them all the time, right? In terms of runaways were the ones who filled their ranks, right? And certainly too, all the way up until this period, it was there was some fluidity going on there. That was the problem. The slave owners or absentee landlords and what have you knew that these folks, there was just a fluidity going on, right? Sometimes the maroon man would have as his wife someone who was in slavery, and then that child would be safer, presumably, for those earlier years of childhood. Then they come get that kid and they be gone, and stuff like that. Actually, you have recorded accounts of that kind of thing going on quite a bit. So that fluidity that was going to end. That was going to be the end of slavery. If the British colonial administrators and others don't figure out what to do, slavery's gonna be over, right? And it comes very close, right? But they turn these guys to be slave hunters, right? And some people say that they snuck the language into the treaties. I wouldn't put that past them, because the British were really up to some very, 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 very shady business, as we'll see another example here shortly of that. Right, they were really up to some very, very problematic stuff when it came to their efforts to try to keep this slave system going. I mean, this is the brutality and the violence and what the slave system was about. So this is what these guys are fighting against. This is what these Maroons fought against, right? And it's funny because if you see there at the bottom left, there's a picture of Man Rowe, who's one of the last of the descendants of the Maroon chiefs, right? And I guess Queen Elizabeth or something was coming to visit Jamaica. I don't know. I mean, it was 70s, 80s, something like that. And they were like, yo, we want to talk to you about the treaty because we're having some issues because all these people setting up tourist spots and all this, taking our land, this, that, and the other. And I guess from the way the story's been told to me. She said, well, essentially the British government tried to deny they had ever even signed the treaty, right? And then so here goes my man. Well, he got mad, pulled the treaty out, and there he is holding it for the picture. He said, "Oh yeah, here you go. Here's your treaty right here." And of course the picture's in the British or the Jamaican Museum. Now that's where I requested a copy of the image, but it always makes me laugh when I think of it, right? But yeah, they have to hunt down their former partners, man, and it does cause for some problems. But don't think too that again the fluidity completely goes away, because it doesn't. I mean, people still run away and go up to join the Maroons regularly, right? And so the Maroons become a thorn, essentially, in the side of English slavocracy in Jamaica, in the Caribbean, right? And for folks who don't know, before and even after the loss of the American 13 colonies, there was money pumping in and out of Jamaica, and as a large amount in terms of part of the English system of let's call it what it is, colonialism, right? To take advantage of through exploited labor, the sugar market, right? This is why the Dutch and the English wrestled this from just the Atlantic accessibility from the Portuguese and the Spanish, because they're starting to figure out the sugar in Brazil, but very quickly the British and the Dutch. And in the French too, as well, sure on the scene, and then it's just too competitive, right? And the way the Portuguese and the Spanish may have operated in the 16th century is no longer viable in the 18th century, right? So you got folks that can move fast and quick and know how to get down, and that's why they come and take over, right? And they want a real slavery. They're talking about this is real profit. This is money, right? And you got slave labor. You got large numbers. So this is why these coastal forts become so valuable, because you're bringing them out. And see, the Gold Coast was a thing because the gold was a thing that was such a feature of all of this. It was the exchangeable commodity, right? But once more and more, I mean, early on, 16th, 17th century, that gold is what kept it going out of the Gold Coast, right? But as more and more on the American side, things get stronger in terms of the plantation and the infrastructure of the plantations more stabilized, right? You get to a situation where with such a sort of stable system, it's hard to it's hard to beat that, right? So now you need more and more people to come in, and then that's what will just make the human trade to go just shoot up, and the gold just drops out of the scene some, in part until later in the 19th century. But yeah, I mean that's when people become so valuable, right? But if we fast forward now just a bit, because remember the Maroons were signed those treaties in 1740, 20 years before the American Revolution. They signed a treaty to gain their freedom, right? Based on African rights, and also an acquiescence to British authority, colonial authority, in a way that they say, okay, you're gonna leave us alone, we're gonna leave you alone. One thing we ask you to do is if slaves come to your place, you capture them and bring them back. And they did, and they didn't, right? Believe me, there was some negotiation in there, right? Believe me, right? And the fact that, again, I will mention it again, the free black slave and maroon familial and cultural affiliations, right, can to some degree extinguish animosities, right? To some degree, but the tension is still there. Believe me, because you have moments, right? There's an event, and this is one of them, right? This is one of them, right? Uh, uh, um, so you got two Maroons who get flogged for killing some hogs, right? They killed these wild hogs, or these hogs, not the wild hog, because the boar is different. The Maroons would hunt the boar in the mountain. That's a different hog, right? But this is the ones that in the pen, right? And you know who is the one who will execute the punishment? It's a runaway that they had actually at one point previously captured and drugged back into slavery, right? For whatever reason. So you can about imagine what he did when he found out that the same people who had captured him, he was now instructed to whip them, right? I mean, you can catch his tension and anger, but the other piece there too, of course, is just wow. Just I mean, you see how the system has pitted different groups against each other. And that's one of the legacies. That's one of the takeaways of a sort of tension and a frustration that the black experience. And some folks know what I'm speaking of here. I'm talking to maybe black men when I'm speaking about this, right? There's a legacy of that tension And these are some of the features of that. Yes, these are some of the features of that, right? So he will exact punishment on these guys, right? And so then the Maroons, they're upset. They go back up to the mountains and they say, yeah, yo, it's time. We're gonna fight again, right? We're about to fight again. We're angry, right? We've been maltreated, right? And the governor at the time, Governor Balcarres, declares martial law, and then this is like 1795. So uh, the Maroons, the Haitians have just burned Le Cap in 1791, burned it down and chased the French up out of there, all the way up to Louisiana and other places. They're running out of there because the Haitians tore the place down to reestablish and take back their freedom. But you remember, you see how early on the Maroons had already been engaged in some of this process. This lets us know that it's not a blip on the screen, that people are always consumed with maintaining and securing their liberty, right? So that's one thing that you can take. That's a massive takeaway amidst the slave system, is the desire on the part of many folks to keep themselves as free people, regardless, right? So that should be noted, right? And yeah, so the contingent so you can see Bakari, he's scared because now not only is Haiti disrupting and shaking up, now you got locally here in 1795, right? And then they started looking like they were going to do like they had done in the past, right? When they would get in, folks, and you can see them. There you see in this picture to the right here, them dressed in what they call their ambuscade. You can barely make out the person there in the top left, right? Because he's all covered in trees. But they would get the cane bill, the flat blade that was used to cut sugar cane, and take that with them. And then you hide in that forest, you sneak out and do your bidding, and then man, dangerous. And they had weapons and rifles and other. They become very, very dangerous, treacherous. And again, they look like it was 1740, 1730 all over again. People started getting scared, thinking that slavery was about to be in trouble on this island, right? Because they were taking away, burning plantations, carrying away slaves. Because a lot of times this carrying away, what it meant was sometimes captive, but also sometimes people was like, okay, finally, y'all, you did it, huh? Okay. So they're going to join, right? They may not have been openly supportive of your efforts until they saw that what would actually occur, right? And so as slavery is beginning to become disrupted, right? Not a single Maroon is even known to have been killed at all, right? And again, a handful of untrained Negroes defiled the whole force of the island, descendants of a people who on similar contests gained their object, right? What is Bakari is talking about there? Well, you know what he's talking about. Here we go again. These Maroons is tearing us up, right? But man, it gets shady, shady, shady at the end of this. This one turns out real, real, real shady, and it really speaks to the questions of abolition and other things, which we'll talk just a bit about as we wrap up. But I want to just sort of get into this little story here very quickly. At the end of what is called the Second Maroon Wars of 1795, started by this killing of these hogs, and up in the Trelawney Maroons, they began to fight. But how did they get them to surrender on no condition other than the promise of their lives? Trick them onto ships. Well, they did a couple things that just were very, very, bad. First, they bought these dogs that they had been training, that they had been using in war, and unleashing them and training them to go after the people in the mountains. So they said somewhere 100 or so of these dogs all ready to go. So this was scare tactic stuff, of course. And the other thing was that, see, these guys went out on their own and did this because they were mad about an incident, right? And really what you see begin to happen about it, if you go between 1740 and 1790, leadership has been diminishing. And really what's really happening is slowly but surely, the British have been ticking away and chunking away at the Maroons. And they're trying to break them down. And because they know, I think on some degree, it seems very obvious that you can't keep people who have broken away from slavery, because they're always going to be a symbol to everybody else that you can get up out of there. That's slavery. And then you don't want that. All right. You don't want that, because then it reminds people, oh, I ain't free. I ain't enslaved. At least by these bums, I can break up out of here. I can break up out of here. There's people up here. And that was a thing. So you had to get that broken up. So leadership is diminished. So no one's there to tell these two Maroons, calm down. Don't enrage everybody else. let's figure out a plan, strategy and a plan in light of what's going on. And in fact, the leader at the time was a guy by the name of Montague. And they said, well, he liked to wear the cap, but that was about it. He liked to look like the leader, but he wasn't necessarily the leader. But again, it's a diminishing authority. Things are changing. Now, the English, as part of their treaty too, have snuck in. There has to be a marshal or sort of someone who's going to live not with the Maroons, but close by them at all times. That was another agreement that they hashed out. So you could see them begin to sort of slowly but surely. And then the way that the Maroons fought, right? The army started adopting some of these tactics, as you could imagine, right? But what they do is they give they trick them. They give the Maroons an ultimatum. They say, if you don't come down by this day, we're gonna let the dogs go. We're gonna blast up every day, and we're gonna call up other Maroons, some of your enemies, this, that, the slaves. We're all coming for you if you don't come out of here by such and such day. But really, he had already planned to say, you know what? I'm taking them up out of here. Whatever happens, they're going out of this, off of this island, right? And that was ultimately Barkari's plan, right? And so he tricks them, and so he says all these people are free. He tells them, if you come down now by treaty and just give up by this date, I'm gonna let you guys go. That's what he told them. He goes, I'm gonna resettle you. We're going to have an agreement. I'm going to resettle you on new land. So many people say, okay, I'm going to do that. Let's just get the new land. Let's go live off someplace else. And then we can just continue as we've been doing. We don't have to be engaged like this, right? But really what he did was he put them on, he lined up ships next to a building, right? And he invited the people in. He said, we're going to have a great feast, right? It was called the Great Feast, the Treacherous Feast. It's the name of a tradition, right? And apparently he would tell all the people, go on up this little, 2 flights up here. When you get up here, it's a delicious meal up here when you get up here after you've agreed to the new rules. And so people are coming down. I mean, you can imagine by this time, I mean, war is taking its toll on things. So you can't hunt and get and do your sustainable way of living because the war is the main thing, right? So people were probably like, okay, yeah, let's do it. But the thing was that once they get in here and they close this door, then they push them onto ships, and they really basically like either you get on the ship or you fall in the water. So you make your call, right? And so people got pushed on these ships, so they put everybody up there. But the story goes that there's a guy there who's an Akan, an old blacksmith he's supposed to be, right? And he's sitting there beating a drum on the iron, and he's singing something to these folks in tree, and he's telling them, don't go, don't go. If him sell his nation, him sell himself. He's talking about the British, right? And he's talking about the Maroons too, right? He's telling them, if him sell his nation, him sell himself, right? So it's kind of it's a statement on a couple things. Think about what it's saying about slavery, right? But for these folks, some people heard him in tree, like telling people, "Hey, go back. This is a bad plan. They're taking people off of here." They heard it, but now some of the younger one they said didn't hear, and so then they marched on anyway. But that's the tradition. They did in 1795. The Maroons were taken. The trailing Maroons were taken because you know where they end up in of all places, Sierra Leone, right? They go back and they actually act as a police force to stop the free black settlers there of all places, right? So it's an interesting story there, right? What becomes of the Maroons there in that sense, right? I just want to sort of double back now to some of this because I've been talking a bit about the sort of impact of Maroonage and other things and what it maybe would mean in terms of abolition, right? And this sort of intersection, this interaction, right? At home and abroad sort of thing, right? If we want to get to a sort of colonial sort of conversation around that. By home and abroad, I mean, what's happening in London and what's happening in the British West Indies, right? This, the metropole, the center and the metropole, right? This exchange of ideas, right? In between those spaces, right? What's going on there, right? On the periphery. And then what's happening at the center, right? In terms of things like abolition, right? And what becomes apparent is that it's kind of as you could imagine, presumably this sort of dialogue between both spaces, right? So at home, maybe in England, you got T.F. Buxton, a member of Parliament at the time, talking about abolitionist sort of ideas, right? But how are these sort of intersecting with the planter class, the Jamaican elites who have money vested in the sustainability of slavery, the pro-slavery folks, right? So what's that going to play out, right? Well, they're having a sort of a conversation, right? But they'll agree on some things. That's what I think is very much significant here, right? They agree that, and this seems oversimplified, but just sort of put this all together. They agree on that the issue is the free labor versus slavery. What's going to happen in the future? Are we going to use slavery forever? Or are we going to start using free labor? That's the question, right? Another one is the political economy. In other words, what will we be? A slavocracy, right? I mean, what's the future? What kind of economic system can you create that's going to be more equitable, or at least one without slavery? What's that going to look like? I mean, that's kind of part of a question that becomes integral to this dialogue, right? And also just the notion of the sustainability of the economics as they are also, right? So that's another sort of issue that folks sort of are having some conversation on. Another one is this issue of demographics and population, right? Those demographics and population, that's at the center of this conversation, right? So what am I saying here, right? Before I get to this last one, people say that the question is about what type of, are we going to have free or slave labor? People say, what's the future, or what is the context of this discussion to the political economy? Right? And at the center of this are questions of demographics and population that rustle out. You can't keep bringing people over here. And what about the ratio of men and women? These kinds of questions, right? But all that, they could agree on those, but they also agree on this one. Accepting emerging scientific sort of understandings of race. And what do I mean by that? Well, some of you already know, right? We'll look at the picture there on the right, and you pretty much have it. Right? They could construe these Africans as inferior folks. Both could agree. Even the people who thought they should be free thought they were on the bottom, right? Else, why does colonialism in the 19th century, after slavery is abolished, go to such great lengths of violence and what have you? And propaganda, let me just say that, less so than the violence, the propaganda of it, making a case of it. Think White Man's Burden, written in satire, but still. So you have this sort of notion, and right, and what a very famous historian has sort of captured this phrase from the 19th century of a mighty experiment, right? Seymour Drescher writes a book called Economicide, which is a very sort of unpacking of these issues of abolition and its relationship to economics and other things, right? But he sort of coalesces around this argument. Haiti, Sierra Leone, Jamaica, even to some degree, maybe North America, or this has impact for North America. Let's put it that way, right? Are part of experiment, right? Well, what's the experiment? What does Haiti show us in the experiment? Hey, what's Haiti's history, right? The slaves gain their liberty and get free. What's Sierra Leone's history, right? Well, that becomes a place like Liberia, where you resettle free Black people, right? There's all kinds of issues and things around there, right? Mighty experiment. And now you got these bustling Maroons and a growing push towards abolition in Jamaica, right? And so what have we achieved, right? What is freedom potentially gained given by giving or granting or bestowing freedom, right? What have we gained? Essentially, what have the British gained, right? So from this experiment, right, right, and then it's in that sort of context too, right, where you got things. If I could just sort of get past this quickly, I'll just stress the fact that the sugar game is changing, right? Technology's coming in, right, and no longer is sugar going to be protected, right? Because one of the things that's happened is that there's a way now you can with the beet sugar, which is starting to come on the scene. This is by the middle of the 19th century for sure, right? And that's beginning to change. That's signaling a change in things, right? You don't need all these people to get all this sugar anymore, right? That's a sign of a dramatic shift that's afoot, right? And even though it's funny, U.S. and Cuba and their sort of interrelationship with this, because the United States will buy cane sugar from Cuba, right? I mean, that's kind of a little bit of a separate piece there, right? But I don't want to beleaguer this or stay on this too long, but I just want you this. So what I'm sort of getting at are the problems and questions of what the Maroons are doing. Decided that they should be free, and that they're basing their freedom on sort of African ideas. I think at the root of this is part of the question that's being raised. And sure, there are other sort of features of Drescher's argument, and I don't even think I would be careful to put that into Drescher's argument. But for me, what comes out of this is that, let's say it that way, right? And even though, there'll be some pushback on this sort of idea of this what we come to the black question, and this puts it nicely because how it's described is a bit more negative. And you have folks like John Stuart Mill sort of responding to that and critiquing Carlyle's sort of question, right? The black question as he describes it, right? Am I a man and a brother, right? And look at the sort of way they're rendering the sort of maroon breakaway from freedom idea, right? And look at the way they're contextualizing this push towards liberty, right? Doesn't look like the freedom that maybe we would think of it. I mean, just you can sort of, there's some ideas suggested there, right? And I don't even mean sort of the characterizing the way the face or whatever, what have you. I mean, yeah, there's a problem there too, but I just mean look at what freedom means, right? And then they put it in the context of, if you know, am I not a man and am I not a brother? That was the part of the anti-colonial. That was their quote. Folks who were trying to end slavery, abolitionists, this is what they talked about. Am I a man and am I a man and a brother? Right? Jupiter Hammond. Right? Couldn't think of that name, but he said that in about 1780 or so to Americans. Right. So this is the way this all sorts of, there's intersectiveness going on with all of this, as you can see, right? But anyways, I know I'm spending too much time on this stuff. I don't want to go too far. But this abolitionist push is a piece, right? Uh, uh, um, in Jamaica, and as the Trolling Maroons finally are subdued, what have you. And by the time you get into the 19th century, 1807, the British abolished slavery, right? And so basically what you have is they're going to do an apprenticeship system up until 1833, right? So all slavery is abolished, and then you're going to keep people enslaved for about another, I say, 25 years, just to say, okay, so we can gradually phase it out, right? But during this time, and even prior to this, right, more and more, what does Jamaica mean in the British mind? Here we are again with this sort of home abroad stuff, right? You can think about sort of in the mind of folks, right? What were they thinking of? The money that you could make, the planter class money, right? Or abolition and evangelism, right? So people want to get out and say like, hey, let me go save these folks, right? So it was a wild west for folks who were led by Providence, right? And I'm taking some of the phraseology out of some of the texts of the era, right? Who describe it that way, right? But again, you got some problems because again, this evangelism presumes the savagery of African culture and the need for them to be cultural and socially separated from an African homeland. What's wrong with that? Yeah, lots, right? And so the idea of Christianizing folks comes with this whole piece, right? Uh, um, but ultimately, though, the African side of this is just it moves past this, right? And I even mean in terms of its intersection with Christianity, as you'll see in a moment here, right? But it sort of pushes out of this, right? The Baptist Crusade of 1831, right, was a strike by the workers to ensure the end of slavery and say, when this is over, too, by the way, make sure get ready because we want to be paid right. So this is going to lead right into us being good laborers, fair labor is being paid a good wage. That's what I'm trying to say there, right? And ensure the end of slavery, right? Led by Samuel Sharp, right? And it integrates Christianization, but in a way in which the Africans took in Christianity in their own right and began to use it as a sort of symbol, just like the African spirituality, just like the Maoism that we talked about last week, just like the Obi that we talked about today, right? Aspects of this sort of Christianity, of Islam, and in this Ethiopianism, as we'll call it, that's connected to this sort of Maoist from the West Central. Remember Maoism, the breathing breath, right? Right? These spiritualists who had this Myo power, that was what they were able to do, and they were able to heal in that way, right? This was the idea, right? So that voice being vital. Think about the way it will intersect with Ethiopianism as a sort of belief system, right? A homeland, a direct counterpoint to the presumption of some evangelists that they should separate that tie to a homeland. Ethiopianism was folks binding themselves to that through Christianity, right? And so this rebellion is a big one, right? And even though it's going to end, and actually, as you can see, quite a folks, many number of folks will end and lose their lives, right? And sort of summary trials and executions of hundreds of slaves, right? And they can frequently be very, very one-sided, biased sort of examples, right? But at any rate, slavery's unconditionally ended in 1834, right? And the abolition of all chattel labor. So you can't have anybody working in these sort of chattel gangs anymore in 1838 in Jamaica, right? So I mean, it says something about things, right? And you know, I mean, I'm not gonna jump right to Rastafarianism, as I put up the slide that jumps right to Rastafarianism, but there's some connectivity. I'm not gonna say. I mean, don't look for this to be linear. You know what I mean? Don't look for this to be linear. Don't think that you're going to be able to say, "Oh, I can almost seamlessly draw a line from aspects of African cosmology, spirituality, Christian aspects of from European and even Native American ideas and how they were sort of coalesce around. All that stuff is it's just all over the map. You know, they're features of an experience. I mean, I think you have to be careful how you sort of draw them together, right? But having said that, yes, our folks from West Central Africa who become captives, who become spiritualists, who become nihilists, right? And then when they're introduced to Christianity and reform it into a new way where the voice becomes essential, singing becomes essential, call and response becomes essential. And that's that voice again. You gonna tell me that there's no connection there? Right? And we know that the Ethiopianism is at the root of the Rastafarian ideas, right? And so again, there's some connectivity, right? Just as much as you talk about disconnect, you talk about connect, right? First Ethiopian Baptist Church in Jamaica, 1783. But really the first church, right? And don't you're gonna hear maybe I think they're doing something on NBC about African Americans. I think we're talking about the first church. I'm gonna be watching because I gotta make sure they're gonna make sure they talk about George Lyle and Georgia in 1773 because that's the oldest church in the United States, right? Before the American Revolution. I think that's the church they're actually talking about, First African Baptist Church, right? And George Leo, man, he's amazing. He's an amazing figure, another underrecognized figure, right? Who his master at the time actually frees him, right? And they're going out trying to convert and evangelize, and his master gets shot during the American Revolution. I think his arm gets blown off or something, and he ends up dying. And so George Leo's like, "Uh-oh, I gotta go because not everybody's friendly like me this relationship we had. That didn't see me as well. He wasn't my master. We saw each other as whatever, as equals to some degree." George Leo writes about some of that as well, by the way. But anyway, so he gotta go. I gotta go. So he ends up in Jamaica, right? And then when he goes down there, he's like, because the people who are going to preach to the Maroons are just as you saw them. They come in with this old language of let your African roots go, stop playing those drums, get rid of those Akande names, and become these sort of practicing Christians, right? And George Leo was telling them, nah, think about how these things connect with what is going on and what we know in the Bible. And he literally wrote a number of sermons where he sought to draw some parallels between African cosmology and Christianity. I mean, that's at the front of it, right? If you think about the time frame and the context of that, right? And yes, will this stuff be something that will encourage abolitionist and immigrationist ideas and a burgeoning and transformative spirituality? You better believe it, right? And then you got folks like Leonard Howe, who again, Howe comes from this tradition of these Ethiopianists, right? These voices, these preachers, man, these powerful voices. The voice. I mean, think about Garvey. What a voice, right? And then wow, what a voice. I mean, a powerful voice, right? And Howe was one of his, he was a Garveyite. He was a supporter. He was a follower of Marcus Garvey, right? Uh, um, and these folks are the ones who begin to sort of are at the root of the transition or the integration of whatever you want to call it, where the beginnings of Rastafarianism start to take root, right? Some of the root, you hear Babylon. Everybody talks about Babylon. What is Babylon, right? Well, it was Jamaica. It's the United States. It's a living hell because it's the place where they're seen as the bottom. It's the place where people are presumably are seen at the bottom of African descent. And so Zion obviously would be Africa. Because wow, you're not gonna be seen as at the bottom, right? So that's the sort of notion there, right? And he came with some other things. I mean, Haile Selassie, you could Google him. If you get a chance to watch the Bob Marley film, just pay attention to how Rita Marley reacts to and interacts with when she sees Haile Selassie on his visit to Jamaica, right? He flies over there. You know, the Ethiopians, they have been flying planes from early. They were flying planes early, right? Cruising around in jets. They already knew how to fly. That's, you know, you know, when things happened here just recently with that plane crash, there was some consternation around that because, I mean, again, the Ethiopians have been flying for quite some time, you all, as a nation. Oldest in Africa and older than a couple of European nations, I'm sure. They've been flying for quite a bit. Going into the part of the earth. I only say that because he cruises up in his plane. He lands in Jamaica, and then people just, you know, they believe him to be a god, an incarnation of God, right? This sort of special person, right? Because of this maybe connection he has to a Davidic lineage, right? Lion of Judah, this kind of thing, right? So, but these are the themes that were stressed. These are part of the themes of the Rastafarian. So the belief system, natural living, return to this motherland, right? And Selassie, when he's talking to the um, Jamaicans in 1966 during that visit, reminding them of this. And I think it has resonance for us today. Liberation before repatriation, right? So it's just something very interesting to sort of end and wrap up on. But you can see that there are really important sorts of understandings and features of you know, when you see Rastafarianism, you see, you know, you listen to Bob Marley. I mean, some of that stuff is drawing us back to some of these very, very early, very, very relevant, very, very important historical experiences and peoples, like Maroons, like Grandy Nanny, like her brother Kojo, right? There's so many other stories, like the Trelawney Maroons and the Treacherous Feast, right? You hear Bob Marley sing, when he's singing 400 years, man, he's getting you in there. He's trying to tell you about some of that, you know, so that type of thing. And so I hope you enjoyed this. I hope this helps you sort of make sense of the films and some of the attached archival material as well. All right.